If you are a network engineer working on F5 and fed up of doing initial configurations manually on hundreds of devices, you must start the journey of automation now. And by now, I literally mean right now. Even if you do not have any coding experience, no worries. In this video, I'm going to walk you through each and every step and assist you so that you can write your own code by the end of this video. In this demo, we are going to use Terraform as our automation platform, using which we are going to configure our F5. So Terraform is an open source tool which is developed by HashiCorp. If you want to follow along with me, the main prerequisite would be, first, you set up your F5 with just the IP address and you get the details of your admin username and the password. You must install Terraform on your system. And for coding, I'm using Visual Studio. You can write your code in Notepad as well. It is just because of the interface which Visual Studio provides. I'm using this. So with this, let's get started and let's see what we are going to configure in this F5 setup initially. We are going to start with defining the host name of the device. Then we are going to configure the NTP and the time zone. After this, we are going to set up the DNS server on our F5. And then we are going to define this various self IPs and VLANs so that F5 can communicate to various other devices in our network. So before we get started, let me give you a brief overview of Terraform Workflow. Terraform basically works by defining a main configuration file. This has extension of .tf, wherein there are different blocks that you are going to define, in which we are going to mention what is the infrastructure on which we are going to do the configuration, what are the various components that we are going to do. And after defining all these components in our Terraform configuration file, then the next step is to initialize the configuration. The main reason of initialization is so that the Terraform module downloads the plugins which are required for your system or Terraform to be able to communicate to the infrastructure that you are going to use. After initialization, the next phase is planning. So planning basically gives you an idea of what Terraform is actually going to implement based on your code. The code that you have defined, based on it, what are the various components that Terraform is going to build. And then at last, we are going to build our environment by doing a Terraform apply. Let us see the basic components that I have used in this specific Terraform code. First is your provider block. This mainly represents the platform on which you are going to build. It can be like, for example, you're doing the coding for building an environment on AWS. So in that case, AWS becomes your provider. In my case, since I'm trying to do the configuration on F5, so BigIP will be my provider. So like this, there are many providers that are supported by Terraform. Next is the resource block. This is one of the most important part in your Terraform code, which identifies one or more components of your infrastructure. For example, in terms of F5, it could be like defining your self IP, defining your VLANs, defining your DNS. So these are various resource components that we are going to define. And then the last part is depends on. This is like defining the dependency. For example, when you are doing the configuration on F5, you cannot create a self IP if you don't have a VLAN defined. So there is a dependency in terms of doing the configuration. So with this, now we have got a basic idea of what we are going to achieve in this. Let's jump into the demo. Before we start writing the code, let's have a look at our F5. This is my F5. Let me log in. So at present, if I check the configuration, let's say if I go to system, go to configuration, device, NTP, I can see there is no NTP configured on my device. Let's go to configuration, device, and DNS. This is coming from my DHCP, so let's just delete this. And let's delete this as well. Let's click on update. So at present, there is no DNS configured on my F5. And if you see, if I go to platform, this is the default hostname. I want to change it as per my requirement. And at present, the time zone is America, Los Angeles. And if I see the network part, I can see all my interfaces are uninitialized, and there are no self IPs defined. And if I go to my VLAN section, there are no VLANs defined. So currently there are no configuration on my F5. So let's try to build this configuration using our code. So before we get started with the coding, let me also show you, if you just search for Terraform providers, you can see here a list of various providers which Terraform supports. So like, for example, there are different classifications: major cloud, cloud infrastructure softwares. If you go to the network section, you can see here there are different vendors which are supported. So I'm mainly interested in F5. If you click on F5 Big IP, with respect to F5 Big IP, you can see the various resources which are currently supported under this provider, and each of these resource have different values within and different uses. For example, this is for node creation, this is for policy creation, and once you click on this, you can see an example. Let's say, for example, if I just click on Big IP command, this will give me an example uses how you can use this specific block. So if you are not sure of how you can write your own code, you can always take this as a reference to define your different blocks, and all those blocks together can build up your infrastructure. So with this, this was just a basic, this was just to give you a basic idea of how we start writing the code. Now let's start by, this is my Visual Studio in which I'm going to write the code. Let's create a directory. Let's say I'm giving it a name as F5 deploy. Now I'll go inside this directory. And in here, I'm going to create a Terraform configuration file. So let's say I'll go to file, new file. Now, the first component, how we are going to write the code is, let's say, I'm also going to keep this side by side. let us say I'll log out from here. So first component is to let the Terraform log in to your device. And you also have to tell the Terraform what is the base infrastructure component which I'm trying to do the configuration or trying to interact with. And that is what we define in our provider block. So in order to define our provider block, I will give provider and then the name. So in my case, the name is Big IP. Big IP is a provider. And whatever value that with respect to this provider we are going to define in our curly braces. So let's say in this provider block, the first component that I'm going to define is my address. The Terraform has to contact my F5. So how will it know which F5? So that is defined by my address field. And with respect to address, what is the value? The value will be my F5 IP address. So this value I'm going to define in double quotes and define my IP address. So 192.168.0.44. Now Terraform knows the IP address. It also has to know the username and the password to be able to log into the device. So for this, again, I'm going to use that attribute as username, and the value of this would again be defined in double quotes, which is admin. Let me first just save this file. So I'll click on open, save as, save this in my F5 deploy folder, and make sure you give this a name as, let's say, give this a name as F5 setup, and with the extension as .tf. I'm using double quotes to make sure this does not get saved as a text file, since this is a Terraform configuration file. So I'll save this. Now I have provided the basic information on how the Terraform can log in, or the main platform on which I'm going to interact with, what is the address, what is the username. So I will also have to provide my password. The password is, this is the password which I have set initially. After this, the next part, what I'm going to define is my host name. So for host name, if I go to Terraform's website, you see in here, do you see any specific component with respect to host name? You cannot find this. You see there is a component for DNS, NTP, SNMP. So I have found out a way. So instead of, since there is no specific component defined here, I can make use of the command component. I know how I can change the host name of my device using my command line. So this big IP underscore command resource module, or resource block we can say, defines or lets Terraform run the specific command on the remote device. So now I'm going to define my resource block. So all resource block needs to start with a keyword as resource. And then I'm going to define what is the specific resource. So in here, this big IP underscore command is my resource. So let's say I'm going to define big IP underscore command. Then Terraform also keeps a track of whatever changes that it has done. So you also have to define or give it a specific local name, which is in the scope of this specific program. So for example, let's say in here, I'm just going to define, uh, give it a name as hostname command. This can be anything. This value can be anything as per your requirement. But this is something which has to be part of the specific resource type which is supported. Now, for this block, whatever values that I'm going to define has to be in your curly braces. So let's see. Let's start defining the configuration. Now, in order to change or define the command, define the host name on my F5, the command which I need to run it, I'm going to define that in my commands attribute. So commands is equal to, then I'm going to define what is the command that I'm going to run. So let's see, for example, this is my F5 command line. In here, if I go to DMSH, then if I click on modify sys global settings, and then there is an option for hostname. So I know the command which I need to use to change my hostname of F5 is modify sys global settings and hostname. And after this, the specific name, whatever I'm going to define. So in here, this is hostname and then the value. So now I know the command which I need to run on my F5 to change the configuration. So let's make use of the same command, modify sys global settings and hostname, and then whatever hostname that I want to set. Maybe let's say I'm going to define as demo f5 dot lab.com. The hostname must have the complete FQDN. So now I have defined my hostname. So this resource block is completed. The next part which I'm going to define is my NTP. So let's see, for defining NTP, do I have anything? In here, you see big IP sys NTP. And in one of the ways, it is quite similar to navigating the specific modules on your F5. So when you want to configure NTP, you definitely have to go to the system module. So big IP is common for all. So big IP underscore sys underscore NTP. That defines your resource block. And that is what we are going to use here. So big IP, sorry, big IP underscore sys underscore NTP. And then in order for Terraform to manage, I'm going to give it a name like NTP1, let's say. And now I'm going to define the values within my curly brackets. So for NTP, if I go, let me log in. So on my F5, I would have to go to system, configuration, device, and NTP. This is where I have to define my address. So for this, the component which is present is defining the servers. So if you don't know what is the attribute which is required for that specific resource, you can just click on this. And once you click on this specific attribute, it gives you an information about the various components which are required. So in here, servers, I'm going to define as the value. What is the server? Let's say I'm going to define as time1.google.com. This is the value which I'm going to define. So always remember, when for a specific attribute, if there are multiple values, so there can be multiple NTP servers which I can add as part of my configuration. So all such components must be included as a list. So that must be included in your square brackets. If you don't do this, you will get an error, and I'll also show you what is the kind of error that you get. So for example, in here, using this, I'm going to set up my NTP server as this, and in the same resource, I'm also going to define my time zone. So this is my time zone. Let's say I'm going to change this time zone to Asia Calcutta. And this is not a random value which I am trying to build on my own. This is the same value what you can see on the device. If I go to platform, in here you can see from the time zone drop down, you go to Asia, you see here Asia Calcutta. So this is the exact value that I have chosen here. And whenever we are defining this, we must define a description with the specific component on my F5. So always we know the objects are by general created on my common partition. So I'm going to define it as common, and then I'm going to give it a name as NTP1. Okay, so now with this, now my NTP part is done. Next component is my DNS. So again, for a DNS, I'm going to use a resource block starting with big IP sys DNS. This is the exact same thing what you can see here, big IP sys DNS. And then I'm going to give it a name. This can be any name as per your requirement. And the values of this specific resource block, I'm going to define in my curly brackets. So with respect to DNS, again, the description component, so slash common slash, let's say I give it a name as DNS1. And then I'm going to define the servers. What are the servers? So again, with respect to DNS configuration also, there can be multiple servers. So usually the attribute value you're going to define under double quotes. So let's say I'm going to set the DNS server as 8.8.8. So let's not put this under square brackets, and later we'll see what is the response that we get when we run this code. So with this, now my DNS part is done. The next component that I am going to define is my VLANs. So let's go ahead. In order to define a VLAN, again I'm going to define a resource block. So for a VLAN, you can see the resource block is big IP net VLAN. So big IP net underscore VLAN. and then I'm going to give it a name. Let's say VLAN1. This name is for Terraform to manage, and all the values of the different attributes within this are going to be defined in my curly brackets. So now let's check on our F5 when we go to network, VLANs. On this page, you can see when I click on create, I am getting an option to enter all these details. Same thing or similar configuration, I'm just going to convert this in my code. Let's see how. So first part is my name. Name is equal to, then again the value that I'm going to define here must be with the common partition. Common, let's say I'm going to create two VLANs, internal and external. So the first VLAN, I'm going to give it a name as internal, and then the tag. The tag name, I'm going to give it as, let's say, 101. And now in the interfaces section, you can see there are multiple values which you have to select. So what I am going to do is, for interfaces, I'm going to define the values again in curly brackets, and within this I'm going to define like the component as my VLAN port. So which port I'm going to use for this, let's say I'm choosing 1.3, and whether I'm going to tag this or not. So for this, the keyword is tagged. If I don't want to tag it, so tag equal to false. So this way I have created a block for my internal VLAN. Similar to this, let me just copy this and paste it again. Let me just call this down. Okay. So the same part, the only change that I'm going to make it is I'm going to give this a different name, VLAN2, and in terms of F5, the name should be external, and then I'm going to give this a different tag, 102, and the interface that I'm going to associate with this is 1.1, and whether I want to tag this or not, for my case, let's say I don't want to tag it, so tag equal to false. So with this, now my VLANs configuration is also done, and now let's see the next component which is left is self IPs. So let's go back to our F5 and click on self IP, and in here if I click on create, now let's define a resource block for our self IP. So again, for this, the name is big IP underscore underscore net underscore self IP. You can see it on this big IP net self IP. So this is the block name, which is kind of defining the resource type, and then I'm going to give it a name for Terraform to manage it, and then within this I'm going to define the attributes values. So for self IP, you can see a name as attribute as name. So name is equal to, again with respect to this, the value has to be defined under common partition, and let's say first I'm going to define as internal self IP, then IP, IP is equal to, this belongs to this segment. IP I'm going to define as, let's say, 10.10.20.240/24. And after this, so with this I have covered both this part and my network mask. Then is my VLAN. VLAN is equal to, then the value, which VLAN I want to associate this with. So slash common slash internal. And now you can see here, this specific block is defining my self IP. So self IP has to be associated with a VLAN. So it is important that you map or add an attribute which says the value of this depends on the value of the self IP. The value of self IP depends on the VLANs. If the VLAN is not successfully created, this cannot be done. So that is wherein we use this depends on, and with respect to depends on, we are then going to call the specific component, which is, let's say, big IP underscore net underscore VLAN, and within this specific resource, the VLAN is VLAN1. So this, with this, now I have defined a block for defining my internal self IP. And similar to this, let me just copy this. And let's change this to self IP 2. And from internal, I'm going to define this as my external. I think I missed F self IP. This is just a name which you are going to give to your self IP, which is user defined. So internal self IP and external self IP. External self IP I'm going to use as, let's say, 10.1.1.240/24, and this belongs to VLAN external, and this depends on VLAN 2. VLAN 2 is the name of external VLAN as per the scope of the code. So this depends on big IP net VLAN dot VLAN 2. So with this, we have finally completed the code which is required for us to configure our self IPs, configure our VLANs, configure our DNS, NTP, time zone, everything is done. So let's save this specific code. And now let me come back to my command line. In here, if I see, I can see my Terraform code file. So first step would be Terraform let's say if you give Terraform plan, let's see what is the error. So the first step is always to initialize. You have written the code, but your platform does not know how to communicate to the infrastructure, and that is why the plugins are required. So in your same folder, the plugins should be present where you have saved your configuration file. So when I ran Terraform plan, it says that could not satisfy the plugin requirement, and that is why we need to run Terraform init. Terraform init, which downloads the plugins. So let me run this. So it is saying checking the available provider plugins. So as I've defined in my code, the plugin as big IP. So it has downloaded the plugin successfully. So after this is downloaded, if you check again in your directory, in the same directory, there will be a Terraform folder which is getting created. Inside this Terraform folder, if you go to this Terraform, and let's check. You can see there is a folder called as plugins. Plugins, which has downloaded the specific plugins which are required for your system to interact with the providers. So now let me come back to my main directory where my code is there. After this, now I have to do a planning. So for this, I'm going to use the command as terraform plan. Now, whenever I run terraform plan, it is going to show me what is Terraform going to build. So whenever I'm running Terraform plan, I'm seeing there are certain errors. So let's see what is this. So in here it says unsupported argument. In the resource type, big IP system DNS, DNS1 servers is equal to the argument servers is not expected. So let's go back to our code. DNS1, it says servers. Let me change this. Let's check Terraform site. So big IP system DNS or system DNS block. You can see here, instead of servers, it is name underscore servers, which is the argument that it is looking for. So let me change this to name servers and save this configuration file. And let me run this Terraform plan again. So this time, if you see for the DNS, it is saying inappropriate value for the attribute. It requires a set of string. So this time it is giving me a different error, and the main reason of this error is because this is like a list. So whenever for any attribute the possible values is like a list, so you have to mention this under double quotes. Let me map this here, and this time let's plan it again. And if I run this again, now I can see there is no more error from this specific block of my resource. Now let's move on to another block, which is self IP. So it says unsupported argument, which is this depend on. So I have mentioned this depend on argument, but actually it is expecting depends on. So it is always it is also required that whatever value that you set for the argument must be same as what it is expecting. So it should actually be depends on, not depend on. So let me save this, and let me change this here as well. Now let's try and run the plan again. This time you can see the error is gone from that specific block of resource. Now we got another error, which is for my big IP command block, which says inappropriate value for attribute commands. So again, with respect to the command attributes, let's go back to our command block. In here there can be multiple values which I can give as part of my command. So if you see here for the command section, let's say, and open the command section. For this command block, I can give multiple commands as well. So the value again has to be inside my square brackets. So let me change this. So I have done the required modification. Let us try to run Terraform plan again. And this time, if you see, there are no errors, but it gives you an output saying or giving you an information of what are the configuration components that Terraform is going to implement in your environment. So you can see the complete output based on your code. It is going to perform the following actions. So it is saying that resource actions are create, and the Terraform is going to run this command, and then Terraform is going to create the self IPs. Self IP will be created like this. The different components what I have defined in my configuration file. So now is the next step, which is applying the configuration or implementing it. So for that, I'm going to use the command as Terraform apply. So let's go back to our F5. Let's start with our self IP stage. At present, you see there is no configuration. Let's apply it here, Terraform apply. So once you do Terraform apply, it will ask you for confirmation again. There are options wherein you can even run it without asking this again, but for now, in this demo purpose, I'm just going to show you how to run the modules at a beginner phase. So for Terraform apply, we just click on yes, so that it is like a approval that I want all this infrastructure to be built. So I'll click yes. So you can see here it is creating the host name, creating the VLANs, creating the self IPs. And if you would have noticed here, now my host name changed based on what I have defined in my code. Now I can see the host name as demo.f5.lab.com. And if I refresh this page, self IP, I can see the self IP is also available here. These self IPs are the same self IPs which I have defined in my code. Let's re-verify this. You can see from here. You see 10, 10, 20, 240, 10, 10, 20, 240, 10, 1, 1, 240, 10, 1, 1, 240. And the external self IP, internal self IP, these are the names which I have mentioned here. External self IP, internal self IP. And now let's go back to our interfaces, we can see the interface 1.1, 1.3 are initialized, and this is mapped to one VLAN. Let's go back to our VLAN page. In the VLAN section, I can see two VLANs created, external and internal. Let's go back. Let's check this from our code. So on our code, I have given the name as internal and external. Same exact thing you can see here. And internal I have associated with 1.3. Internal is associated with 1.3. Tagged is none, so that's why it is in untagged column. And external I have tagged external I have given this as 1.1. External is mapped to 1.1 interface. Now let's go back to our system component, system configuration device NTP, and in here you can see the value as time1.google.com. So if I see my code, for NTP, in here I have mentioned as time1.google.com, and this hostname I've changed it, which it is reflecting. So with this, we have successfully done the initial configuration of our F5 using Terraform and have saved a lot of time just by running this code. You can use this same code on multiple other devices. So just by a click of one command, Terraform apply, all your configuration will be done, and you can sit back and enjoy your time. I hope you found this demo informative and you'll make use of it in your environment. Thank you for watching.